This is a sacrifice, this is a sacrifice, this is a sacrifice, and yes, this is also a sacrifice. Hey, this is Jelle, growing bonsai. I'm going to shift a little bit. Maybe you can now see me. I like sacrifice branches. I use them for everything. The question, however, is when do you remove a sacrifice branch? I have two answers to this question. First answer on the question is when, as in how big do you let the sacrifice branch run before you remove it? The second is when in the year do you remove the sacrifice branches? And I will deal with both of them in this video. Why do I use sacrifice branches? Well, I already said I use it for everything. This is a linden tree. I've been growing it out for a couple of years, and you can see here is the actual bonsai that I'm making. This is just a sacrifice branch to fatten up the base. You can tell the base is a lot thicker than this one. It is already the third sacrifice branch on there. This one I'm letting run to heal a wound. This is also a linden tree. The one that is right in front of the camera, quite vague for you, that is actually there to heal a wound below the surface, because last year I cut off a sacrifice this thick. This one is here just for fattening up the base of that linden tree. First part of the question, when is a sacrifice so big that you need to remove it? Well, that's actually quite clear on this tree. If you look here at the base, this is a little bit bigger than the sacrifice. You could say that the sacrifice branch in itself is about 2/3 of the width of the trunk. That for me is a moment that I say, I need to cut this off. Otherwise you'll lose all taper and this just becomes homogeneously thick. So this is going to be cut off later this year. And why later this year? I'll explain later in the video when we'll deal with what time of year do you cut them off. No, not all of them are cut off later in this year. This one, I said, is here to heal a wound. Not just this one. No, also here on the side there is a small wound that I created when I removed a very big sacrifice here. I will pop a link at the end of the video to the video where I show you how I removed this one. This is now here to just heal over all sorts of small wounds. You see, I have cut back these branches already because I just want small branches to grow. I want this to fatten up to that size. Then I'm going to cut it back, let it run for 1 more year. Then it should have plenty of small branches. I'm going to lift it out of the ground. So I'm going to lift it maybe 2-3 years from now, and then I'll plant it up. This sacrifice gets to run for another 1, maybe 2 years. And although that is a very nice rule of thumb, you remove a sacrifice when the sacrifice is 2/3 of the section of trunk below it, or when the wounds are healed, that doesn't always work. And the reason is, if I look at these wounds here in the back, this requires a lot of sacrifices. They have grown many sacrifices over the years to fatten this trunk and give it this very nice taper. Unfortunately, they never attended to the cuts, and therefore these were soft and they were rotting, and I've had to fill them up. And over the years it will now have to have many sacrifices run out to heal those wounds. And why do they have to have many sacrifices to heal these wounds? Well, quite simply said, if I let a sacrifice run very tall, very fat, until all these wounds on the main trunk have healed, by that time I will have a very big branch. That means that I lose all the taper in this trunk, which is actually quite nice. So that is why this cut was made in fall last year. I removed an Airlayer. It has a few small buds right here at the elbow, and I hope that they will start growing. Otherwise this little branch could be the continuation, and then I'll cut this flush. So always make sure that you keep the aim in mind while you're growing a sacrifice branch. I have another trident maple from exactly the same batch, and this one unfortunately didn't have all that great taper. I have here also treated all the cuts and the wounds, and I've selected a front, roughly this, and this one gets to run quite a bit thicker. I have all sorts of small branches that I'm keeping small here. There's a few buds here in the front. Eventually I'm going to cut it here, but first I want this to double in size. Now you might see that these are in very shallow pots, and you might be wondering, why don't you put it in a much bigger container? And that would indeed speed up the process. It would grow a lot stronger. Unfortunately, that would also make a lot of heavy roots. I don't want heavy roots. Here, the bulk of the main rootwork has been done before it came to me, so I don't really want to rundenabari. That's also why this cloth is on here. It stops the birds from digging, and therefore the soil stays nice and close to the trunk. So this is one where I'm doing two things at the same time. I'm trying to close these big cuts, and I'm creating taper in this main trunk so that it becomes more smooth, if you will. Now, when do you remove a branch like this? That is always a heavily disputed question. And actually, while I'm recording this, I notice I haven't actually pruned this tree at all yet. Maybe I should give it a little prune before I put it back. But where was I? I was at the discussion, when in time should you remove a sacrifice branch? And there's actually a few moments that people often say. There's a group that advocates always do it in the middle of winter. So right now, while the trees are still dormant, we are still in early February, it is going to be tight. I think if I cut it now, it will start bleeding. So typically they say January or December, or you wait until the first flush opens up. So when the buds are opening up, then you cut it, parallel to a repotting session. So that's the second group. The third group says you should wait until the trees have flushed, and then you wait 6 weeks, and only then do you cut. So after the first flush has extended. And then there's this group that says you do it all the way at the end of the season once the tree starts dropping the leaves. And to be honest, all 4 options are valid options. They just have a different outcome. If I were to prune the main trunk back right now, then what would happen? The tree is completely dormant, right? So it has all the reserve stored in trunks, in branches, in the roots, but the tree is ready to start pushing. This, of course, takes a lot of energy from the roots. So the roots are all primed to feed this massive trunk line that sits there. Now, if that trunk line is not there, then the rest of the tree will have to pick up all the energy, all the water, all the reserves that are being pushed into the trunk in springtime. Because in springtime, the trunk gets ready to really push. You can see it, the moment temperatures are up, everything explodes. Now, that means that the length between consecutive pairs of leaves, the internode length, becomes quite long. For me, if I am building a trunk section, I don't want long internodes. I want very, very short internodes because that defines how many branches I get naturally. The more leaves, the more nodes, and therefore the more buds, and therefore the more little side branches that you can get. So I am not a big fan of removing these right now. Then there is the camp that says, well, why not just do it when the tree is starting to push? That is a similar idea as what you have now, but it stops the tree from bleeding, because once you repot, the bleeding stops, and therefore you have less risk of this drying out. Same argument, however, as before, the big push. Now, if you prune the roots, the big push will be less, but still, I don't really want to take the risk. So I am not in this camp either. I'm in the third camp. I'm in the camp of most of the sacrifice branch is removed in spring, after the first flush. So what happens in early spring, the tree just grows naturally, it flushes, and at some point I decide I'm going to just cut this back. At that time, the tree is full of energy, it is alive, everything is actively growing. So if I then cut this off, then all these buds are primed to straight away start growing, but they grow a lot slower because the initial push, all the reserves and all the energy for spring are already allocated in the tree. Typically, I then also partially defoliate, trim the whole tree back, and then you get a fairly docile, slow growth here. The big benefit of doing that is short internodes, and on the other hand, there is hardly any risk of dieback. Dieback, of course, is when you cut something off and the tree decides, well, it's not worth my energy to keep this alive, and it starts drying in, but it dries in and in and in, and it dries in as far as the main trunk or the main branches, and that starts to die off as well, and you lose a large part of your canopy. And this is with Japanese maples a very big risk, with trident maples not so much, and with elms it basically doesn't occur, but still it is something to keep in mind. So for me, after the first flush, say May, June, is when I typically remove sacrifice branches. Now then there is the last camp that says, well, you do it as soon as the tree is starting to go dormant. For me, that is not a good time. Sorry to say, but if you make a big cut in fall, something like this here, and then the tree isn't growing, then I think the risk of dieback is the biggest. Then it might just dry back. So if I have to make bigger cuts anywhere after the growing season, so between, for me, late October until maybe February, I always leave a section that I want to just dry in. I leave a little stump and I say I'm going to cut back to this part. And that's what I showed you in the other maple. So why did I prune the other one in fall when I say that's not my preferred time? Well, actually I didn't really prune back in fall because I had an air layer on there. Late summer I separated the air layer. That is what I did. And what happens when you have an air layer? Well, basically all the sugars that are generated by the top of the tree, they don't go down into the rest of the tree. After all, you've broken the sap connection. Then you start creating roots here. So naturally you reduce the effect of this air layer on the rest of the tree. The roots that take over will take up water, and therefore also the uptake of water on the main trunk is reduced, and the tree naturally closes off all sorts of connections to your sacrifice branch. So putting an air layer in place and removing the sacrifice is actually a very nice, gentle way for the tree to get used to the fact that this branch is going to go. So therefore, in summer, putting an air layer in place can really be a way that you say, I'm going to remove this sacrifice branch. Next to this, other ways to slowly tell the tree, hey, I'm going to remove this branch, is by cutting a section out. And in the other video of the linden tree that I mentioned before, I have actually done that. I've cut out a section of the sacrifice. That way you reduce the sap flow in that trunk. You signal to the rest of the tree, this is becoming less important for you. And the rest of the tree will take over. Connections to the top will be reduced. If you actually do it right at the point where you want to cut back to, then it will fasten the healing of this cut mark. Now, these of course are all. Now, what is the best? I don't think there is the best. There's pros and cons to each moment. There's pros and cons to each way. And you'll need to decide for yourself, what do I value at which point in time? Mostly, I try to separate my air layers May, June, when the trees are in full leaf. I'm not worried about any dieback. I get very slow regrowth. It also means that the wound healing is maybe a little bit slower than normally. If I have to do it on other times, or if I'm removing absolutely big sacrifice branches, I always leave a section in place. And that way I reduce the risk of this dying off, creating very, very ugly scars, like the ones that I have here. I think this is all that I can tell you about when to remove sacrifice branches. Now, as said before, there's one about removing big sacrifice branches right there. And the other one, I don't know. What was the other one? Right, trident maple air layer right there.